the second round of the Qatar Masters Open being held here in Doha. Now, as you know, Magnus Carlsen, myself, Anish Giri, and many other top players are playing. We all won our first round game, but today we play players who are a little bit stronger. Now, Magnus is playing with the black pieces against Alisher Suleimanov from Kazakhstan, rated 25-12. Now, whenever you play opens in the first couple of rounds and you're playing lower rated players, it's a very sort of tightrope. It's very much a tightrope where you're trying to keep the games complicated, but you also don't want to take too much risk and lose the game, but you also don't want the game to peter out into a draw. So the game starts with d4. We get knight to f6, c4, and now we get e6, knight to f3, played here by Suleimanov. Now, after knight to f3, Magnus plays this move b6, which is very surprising because this is the Queen's Indian. Now, bro might think he's Hikaru because, of course, I actually played this during the FIDE World Cup in Baku, Azerbaijan, about a month and a half ago. On the other hand, it's surprising because it tends to lead to very fixed structures here. Normally, if white plays knight c3, at some point you end up with a structure like this where black plays for c5 eventually, or you end up with a situation where down the road, black plays for c5, and again, you get a very straightforward, very stable pawn structure in the center of the board. So, Suleimanov plays a3. Now, the funny thing is that Magnus actually played this a3 move against me in the recent Chess Champions Tour event. This system is known as the Petrosian system. So after a3, we get bishop a6 played here by Magnus, queen to c2, bishop to b7, and now we have this move knight c3. Now, I can tell you guys a fun story from a while back. Now, a couple of years back at the closing ceremony for one of the London Chess Classics, I was in the same car as Vladimir Kramnik. Now, at that time, we were talking about novelties that Kramnik had used or not used. And one of the great novelties that he said he had saved for years and had never used was this novelty with d5. Now, it's become very popular in recent times, but nonetheless, it's not played in this game. So we get bishop b7 played here by Magnus. We get knight to c3, and now we have c5. d5 is a move that can be played in this position, but after d5, normally white trades and goes e4, takes, and something like bishop e7, bishop d3, and c5. You get castles, and queen to e2. Now, Magnus actually played this against me in the Chess Champions Tour. He has played this much more with white than black, and I suspect Magnus simply did not want to play a system where his opponent would get full control of the center of the board. So he goes c5, we get e4 being played here, pawn takes pawn, knight takes, bishop c5, and knight to f3. Now you can get this position or something very similar to this out of the Nimzo Indian as well, just to show you guys. After knight c3, bishop b4, queen c2, you can play this line with c5, takes, knight f3 and b6, a3, bishop b7, and e4 or e3. So it's pretty similar to the Nimzo Indian here. We get bishop c5, knight to f3 back, and now Magnus decides to play knight c6. Now, you're probably thinking, well, can't black go knight g4 to hit the pawn on f2 with the bishop and the knight? Now, you can play this move, but I believe that white can play the move b4, attacking the bishop on c5, and after bishop takes f2, king e2, white has played the classic Bond Cloud in honor of Hikaru, but white is also very serious here. The simple plan is that black castles, you go h3, and suddenly black will lose either the knight or the bishop. So, Magnus plays knight c6 instead. We get b4, bishop to e7, bishop to b2, queen to b8 played here, stopping white from playing e5 and kicking the knight away from f6. We get rook to d1, castles, bishop e2, d6, castles, all pretty normal moves up to this point. And now we get rook to c8 here from Magnus, trying to put pressure on the c file. Here, Alisher plays the move rook fe1. Magnus goes bishop f8, just retreating the bishop, and maybe intending to go knight e7, g6, or knight e5 as well. Here, we get bishop to f1, and now Magnus plays this move knight to e7. Now, Magnus here is intending to put this knight on g6, but he's also trying to open up scope towards the pawn on e4 and pressure the pawn on c4. Additionally, maybe there's d5 as well, since this pawn push is protected by these knights. So we get the move knight to b5, and now Magnus plays the move knight e8. Now here, after knight to g6, black is only marginally worse after bishop takes knight, pawn takes knight, and queen to d3. Now, what I suspect is that Magnus did not want to play this because of the opponent that he was playing against. Now, his opponent is rated 25-12, but when you're playing lower rated players, you want to keep imbalances, and I suspect that Magnus here felt that after knight to g6, takes, and queen d3, it's a very stable position. Even if black goes rook to d8 and white were to play like knight d4, for example, if you ever push d5 after takes, and knight f5, white gets this great outpost on the f5 square. If you can't push d5 and you go a6, knight c3, you still don't really have pawn pushes either at d5 or b5 here. And for that reason, I think that white is simply better. Now, again, I would have probably played knight g6 personally just because here at least you have the two b's. So with the two b's in return for a knight and a bishop, at least there's some imbalance. Instead, Magnus plays knight e8, and this is actually a huge blunder because after knight to e8, white can play his move knight to g5 with the idea of going e5 and checkmating you on h7. If you were to play a6, for example, there's e5, creating this nice little fossil here, because suddenly there are all kinds of mating threats on h7. If you take the horse, checkmate, GG, why not? And here, if you play knight to g6, stopping the checkmate on h7. After knight takes d6, knight takes d6 takes, bishop takes d6, and h4. White is actually close to winning because you have h5 to kick the knight away. You have this great diagonal towards g7. For example, black plays knight f8 here. White can go bishop d3, and suddenly these bishops are really, really strong. And computer says it's GG, why not? One sample line is if you go g6, for example, white can play queen c3 and try to checkmate you on this long diagonal towards the black king. If you play h6, there's bishop h7 check. If you go king h8, knight takes f7 is checkmate. Uh-oh, spaghetti-o. And after knight h7, queen h7, king f8, now white can take the pawn, and suddenly you just get checkmated in the middle of the board without it even being exciting. So, Magnus instead plays knight g6, trying to stop the checkmate threats towards the pawn on h7, but now his opponent plays e5 anyway. Now, this is a crushing move here because Magnus cannot take the pawn. If you take after bishop takes e5, suddenly your queen is trapped. If you take the horse, or you take the bishop, it's checkmate on h7. If you block with the knight, I can simply probably many ways to win. I don't know if knight c7 is cleanest, but even rook d7 created the classic kebab on the 7th rank, and suddenly black is just completely lost because you have all these pieces jumbled up on the first two rows, and they aren't active at all. So Magnus instead plays d5, and now queen b3 has played the absolute best move in this position, and Magnus plays the move bishop e7. Now the reason this is completely lost is that white is threatening to go queen h3. There's also c takes d5, and if you take right away on c4 here, white can play queen h3, threatening mate in 1, and after h6, white can sack the knight with knight takes f7, and after king takes f7 here, white has queen to h5 with the idea of rook to d7 check. If you play bishop d5, I sack the rook for the bishop, and then I go e6, king g8, queen takes g6, and white is just crushing here with this great diagonal here. There's e7 as well, and it's just completely hopeless. So Magnus decides instead to play bishop e7. Now, one thing that's very critical in Magnus' success, I would say any top player when we play lower rated players, is you don't want to end up in a situation where your opponent has to go for a tactical sequence. Now, what I mean by that is after bishop to e7, Magnus' opponent has to go all in here and sack the knight. If his opponent retreats the knight back to f3, for example, you can take on c4, take on f3, can't take with the queen because then you would lose the bishop on c4, and after g takes f3, black can actually play something like queen b7 with knight h4. Now, the funny thing is the computer thinks white is still better here, but it doesn't look right. So when Magnus plays this, his opponent doesn't have options. It's not like there are 3 or 4 moves where his opponent there's only one great move and the rest are slightly dubious or just bad. In this case, his opponent isn't left with options. So his opponent, Alisher Suleimanov, sacks the knight with knight takes f7. Now this, my friends, is a double exclam move. Because after knight takes f7, Magnus has to take the horse. White takes on d5. Magnus recaptures. Now Suleimanov sacks the rook. We get pawn takes rook. Queen takes, king to f8, and now the brilliant move, knight to d4. Now, I don't know if Magnus had miscalculated or what went on, but I suspect that what happened is back here, when Magnus played bishop e7, the line that he simply miscalculated here was that he thought knight d4 was not possible because he could go knight to c7, attacking the queen and stopping knight to e6. Now, this makes a lot of sense, but unfortunately it loses because white is queen f3 check. If you go king to e8, for example, here, white can play bishop c4, and even though black has an extra rook, all these pieces are on the back rank here, and after queen b7, white can take the queen, which is apparently the best move. And if you play, say, rook to d8, just to illustrate, there's bishop f7 check, king d7, queen c6 check, king c8, bishop e6 check, rook d7, queen takes d7, king b7, bishop d5 check, pin and play, and a right triangle. And after king a6, white goes queen a4, checkmate, GG, why not? So here, Magnus, I think his plan was to go knight c7 after queen f3 and to play king g8. But after king g8, white is knight c6, forking the queen and the bishop, and black can no longer save his queen here. If you play queen to b7, there's knight takes bishop, checking the king and creating the classic fossil. After knight takes knight, queen takes queen, white wins the game. And if you play the move rook to f8, trying to attack the queen and free space for your own queen on c8 and e8, white goes queen b3, checking the king, and then taking the queen. And here, white is simply winning because he's a queen for a rook and a knight. So I suspect that this is what Magnus missed during the game, was he missed this queen f3, king g8, knight c6 idea. But unfortunately, it's too late. There's no bailing out here. Magnus is completely lost, even though he's up a rook, due to all the passive pieces. The queen and the rooks are on the back rank here. White is knight e6 incoming, queen f3 as well. So Magnus plays knight to f4 in this position. And now Suleimanov goes queen to f3, pinning the knight. Magnus plays king to g8. Could have tried g5 here. This was a possible move. But after g5, white just goes g3 here. And even though black is still ahead in material here with a rook for a bishop, your king is completely open. White has these active pawns. The knight can go to f5, queen d5, all the diagonals. And black's pieces are just at home. So Magnus plays king to g8. Suleimanov captures a horse. He goes queen to b7. And now knight to f5 is played here, attacking the bishop on e7. And here Magnus plays the move b5, trying to stop white from playing bishop to c4. Unfortunately, white can simply gobble on b5 here, because if you take the bishop, there's knight takes bishop checking the king and forking the king and rook. And after king h8, Magnus Carlsen gets ice skated with queen f8, which is checkmate. So Magnus plays bishop to f8. Suleimanov goes bishop c4. Magnus plays king to h8. And now the move knight to h6 is played. And Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time former world chess champion, largely regarded to be one of the best players of all time, has to resign the game here because he's getting checkmated or will have to give up a lot of material. One sample line is pawn takes knight, queen takes f8 is checkmate. If you play queen to e7, guarding the bishop, there's knight f7, king g8. And now there are many ways for white to win. Probably the simplest is to create the fossil here with knight d6 check, king h8, take the rook on c8, and go e6 here. And now with D's bishops on the open diagonals, the passed pawn with the rook behind it, white is completely winning. So after knight e6, Magnus just resigns the game. It's completely hopeless. He gets crushed by Alisher Suleimanov, the very talented Kazaki player rated 25-12. Now, you'd think this is all there is to it. Magnus lost the game, and that's it. However, after the game ended, Magnus Carlsen would come out with a couple of tweets. He was very unhappy with some of the regulations in the tournament, specifically that players are allowed to wear analog watches. Of course, smart watches with internet connections or 5G are not allowed. But Magnus was very upset, very critical of the fact that it's allowed, critical that there were some press and perhaps some VIPs who had smartphones as well. So Magnus was not happy at all. Now, that being said, people have wondered, what is my take on this? Now, I do think that as far as the regulations go, they've been a little bit lax. Yesterday, there were a lot of people just all around the place with smartphones, just regular fans that should never have been allowed in terms of the playing area. But today, they did crack down on it quite a bit, and I felt that the conditions were pretty normal. So I'm a little bit surprised to hear Magnus say this. It's understandable, but what I was more surprised by was that in Magnus's thread of tweets, he also said that when he saw his opponent was wearing an analog watch, he simply could not concentrate. Now, to me, that sounds like a very, very poor excuse after getting crushed by a player that you normally should beat. Now, it's understandable that Magnus would be very upset, but Magnus Carlsen is the former 5-time world champion, widely regarded as one of the 2 greatest players alive. Ever, alongside Garry Kasparov. And Magnus doesn't need to make excuses. He had a bad game. He walked into a tactical sequence where his opponent was able to play the best moves and blow him off the board. But that's where it should have stood. So definitely surprised that Magnus made this a big issue. Obviously, on the internet, now a lot of people are talking about it. But I will be very clear, his opponent played a great game from start to finish. Easily the best victory of his career. Probably, I think without a doubt, will be the best victory of his career. So we should definitely salute the player, Alisher Suleimanov, who played a great game. It's a little bit disappointing where we are tonight with this being such an issue suddenly, but I think the chess speaks for itself in this game. So Magnus Carlsen gets stunned by a 2500, and now we move to the other game of the day, which is my game where I'm playing against Dai Changren from China. Now, there are a lot of strong players from China who are underrated. I think some of them are like 24, 2500. Many times they can play at 2600 plus, so I had my work cut out for me. So in this game, I start with e4. We get e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now I decide to play bishop c4, bishop c5, and d3. Now, my opponent, Dai Changren, does not play knight f6, which would allow me to try to go for the fried liver with knight to g5, which I used to crush Fabiano Caruana in the final round of Norway Chess earlier this year. So we get bishop c5, d3, knight f6, and now I decide to play the classic Gucci piano with the pawns on d3 and c3. We get d6, castles, rook e1, and now my opponent plays a5. Now, I don't pretend to be a computer or understand how computers think, but both a6 and a5 are playable. I don't really understand what the big differences are, but both have been played many times. So in this game, we get a5. Now I go h3 here, just stopping knight g4 ideas to hit the pawn on f2. We get bishop a7, I go bishop b3, we get bishop to e6, I play bishop c2, and now my opponent plays knight to e7. Now I use a little bit of time here after d4, knight g6, because even though I have this big white center, I had to figure out what the best development plan is. Now, in a lot of Italians as well as Spanishes, you normally go knight d2, f1, g3. That is the standard development almost universally. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking about this famous Dutch grandmaster Anish Giri, who did a course on the Italian. And I don't remember the exact position, but there's one position in his Italian course where he said that basically if white gets this position, with the bishops on d3 and e3, the knights developed, and this big white center, that white has an advantage, but white will have to prove the advantage to win the game. But this is a quote-unquote dream. Now, I don't remember the exact position, but in my mind, I was sort of thinking about the course that Anish did at the time, and that's why here I actually used a little bit of time before playing bishop e3. And the main reason was because I was trying to make sure that moves like d5 were not playable here to explode the center all at once. So we get c6, I go knight d2, now my opponent plays knight h5, and I played this move bishop d3 after a long think. Now, it's very hard to know what the best move is. I really considered playing knight f1, but after knight hf4, knight to g3, and something like f6 here, or even queen to f6, I was a little bit scared about this position. Now, computer shows that there's some tactics with moves like knight h5, sacking the knight, because knight takes knight, bishop g5, traps the queen, but I just wasn't comfortable with black having a knife on f4. So instead, I go bishop d3, and this is also, again, because of Anish Giri. In that course that he did for Chessable, white had the bishops on d3 and e3, so I figured why not put the bishop on d3? It's just one tempo. So we get knight hf4, and now I go bishop to f1, retreating the bishop and guarding the pawns on g2 and h3. My opponent plays f6 here, and now I go king h2 with the idea of playing g3 to kick the horse away from f4. I can't do it right away because then knight takes h3 wins the pawn. So I go king h2 first to guard the pawn on h3. We get bishop f7. I play a4 here. He goes bishop b8. Now, I think this was the start of my opponent losing the thread. Now, one great thing about the Gucci piano or the Italian opening is that all the pieces are on the board. Now, that means that all the pawns are on the board, the bishops and knights are on the board, the queens and the rook, everything is on the board, so there's going to be a lot of play, and the game is going to go on for a long time. Now, I felt that in this position after a4, my opponent probably should have played knight e6 right away here. So if I go something like queen c2, he can trade on d4, and after pawn takes, he's d5. And suddenly, my white center is not so great anymore. I have a serious weakness on d4. Black can go bishop b8 to hit the king on h2, and it feels a little bit iffy. So we get bishop b8 instead, which I think is slightly wrong, but understandable, because my opponent wants to play d5, creating maximum chaos in the center of the board. We have a big white center and a big black center, and my king on h2 is very, very vulnerable here. So instead, I played g3, we get knight to e6, and now I go queen c2 with the idea of bringing my last undeveloped piece, the rook on a1, into the game. We get bishop c7, I play rook a d1, and now we have the move queen e7. Now, this is a big mistake for my opponent here, but he was feeling some pressure on the clock and just in the position in general, because black is very passive. I have this big white center with these pawns on d4 and e4. I've got the rooks in the center. I can put the bishop on c4, knight on c4. These knights don't really have good squares that are available here due to the pawns. They sort of blunt the knights, and so these knights are very unhappy. That being said, my opponent probably still should have played d5 here and exploded the center, because if I were to play d takes e5 and f takes e5, for example, it looks a little bit scary with the pressure on the d file after, say, bishop g2, but black can very quietly go queen f6 here with the idea of playing d4, and if I ever take, suddenly the pawns are very, very active, and I don't have squares for my knights in the center of the board here. So instead, he plays queen e7, and now I play d5, which is an excellent thematic move. Now, it creates an imbalance here, because if black were to trade, you'll notice that if black can get something like, let's just say king g1 and f5 and f4, the bishop on e3 is very weak, also something like e4, and then something like f4, knight e5, and it feels very scary from a general positional standpoint. But the problem here when I go d5 is that black cannot get what he wants with f5 and e4. And additionally, when I play d5, now the black bishop on c7 is extremely passive. You have these pawns that are in the way of the scope. No square on b6, no scope on this diagonal either. So his bishop on c7 becomes very bad. Now, to give you an example of this that can occur from the flip with colors flipped, there's one variation or a certain variation within the Italian where white has this problem, actually, where basically what you get in the Italian is somewhere down the road, white ends up with something like this position, for example. Let's say rook h6, rook e1, queen d7, where the bishop on c2 actually becomes very, very passive here behind these pawns on d3 and e4. So if white ever goes a4, a5, specifically, black is much better because this light square bishop is super, super passive. So as we jump back to the game here after d5, you'll notice that now it's black's dark square bishop that is super, super passive on c7. So we get knight to g5 played here. I trade the knights on g5, and now I play this very thematic move b4, trying to open up this queen side of the board. Now, this is a temporary sacrifice, but black has compromised his pawn structure with the double pawns on g7 and g5. So if black were to take what looks like a free pawn here on d5, I can simply go knight e4, and after takes, Black has weaknesses on b7. The bishops are very, very active here. And white is actually much better, even though he's down a pawn. So my opponent trades on b4, and now he goes rook c8, and here I play the move queen b3. Now I could have taken on c6, but the reason I didn't do it is because after b takes c6, if I play a5 and black gets d5, d4, suddenly black has nice pawns in the center, and it feels like there will be some counterplay. So instead I go queen b3, he plays h6 here. Now he could have traded on d5 here, but after takes, now what happens is I have this great square for the bastion with the knight on e4 here. And after, say, h6, knight e4, white is simply much better because I just start pushing the pawns on the queen side. And the pawns on d6 and g5 are weak in the long term. So we get h6. So here I play bishop to c4. My opponent plays knight to f8. And now I go rook c1. And the whole point behind this is that I don't want to ever end up with this pawn structure. I'm intending to always take on d5 with the bishop. So after rook to c1, my opponent does trade on d5 and then goes knight d7, trying to reroute this knight to f6 to put pressure on the pawn at e4, but also try to push the pawn to d5 and open up the scope for the dark square bishop. So here I play queen to d3, and now he goes bishop d6 here, which is a mistake. The reason I play queen d3 is because I would love to simply go bishop takes b7, forking the two rooks. But if I try to go bishop b7 right away, I do a classic Botez gambit. I lose the queen and I lose the game. So I play queen d3, my opponent plays bishop b6, and now I blunder by playing this move knight c4. Now, sometimes one thing that happens is when you're calculating on your opponent's time, they're a little bit low and you're trying to press them a little bit, is that you calculate, and then when they actually play their move, if you've looked at a line, you don't stop to think. And this is a perfect example of where I had actually looked at bishop b6 while my opponent was thinking, and in my mind, I thought just go knight c4 and knight e3. Now, this effectively loses the game on the spot, because I can actually trade the rooks first and then go knight c4, hitting the bishop. And if black takes the bishop on e3, I move knight takes d6, forking the rook and the bishop here. And if black takes a horse, I take the bishop with check, I create the fossil, and after king f7, queen d6, I win the game. So in this position, after knight d6, black is completely lost. Let's say he goes rook f8, for example. I can go knight takes f7. If you play bishop takes f2, I have rook f1. And after you move the bishop to, say, a7 here, for example, there are many ways to win. Probably simplest is knight takes e5, king to h7, and now this beautiful move, knight g6, forking the rook and the queen. And after king g6, I have e5, checking the king. And after king h5, g4, king has to go to h4, queen g3 is checkmate, gg. But, as I said, I was calculating on my opponent's turn, so I end up playing knight c4 instead. He trades the bishops, but now my knight is great on e3 because it's headed towards either d5 or f5 with a bastion. My opponent plays rook takes c1, I go knight f5, queen to f8, rook takes c1, and now he plays the move knight to f6 here. Now, after knight to f6, it's very tricky because I'm up a lot of time on the clock, and I feel like I should have a simple way to win without getting the time control, but you still have to think and come up with the best moves. So I play bishop takes b7. He goes rook to d8 here. An excellent move during the game. I was only looking at rook b8, and after rook c7, d5, knight to e7, white is completely winning here because I have these two pawns that I'm pushing up the board on the queen side. So he goes rook to d8. I play rook to c7 here with the idea of playing knight to e7. So he plays king h8, dodging the fork. And now I play the move queen c2. Now, queen c2 is oddly enough the best move, but I was actually very unsatisfied during the game and actually right after the game. So I felt like in this position, I should have something simpler to win. Now, I really wanted to play a5, but I was just very unsure what's happening after d5 because, first of all, there's pressure on the f file if I ever move my knight down the road. Like something like this, all black needs is one knight move and then f2 falls. And additionally, if I take on d5 here, there's maybe bishop g6, there's maybe knight takes d5, and it's just very, very chaotic in the center of the board, and I felt like there's got to be a better way. So instead, I play queen c2, and now my opponent plays d5. Now, initially, when I played queen c2, I was expecting d5, and I was going to play this move rook to c8. But if I play rook to c8 here, after knight takes e4, white is still probably winning after the trade in a5, but with moves like bishop g6 or bishop e6 here, I wasn't 100% sure. So instead, I play queen c5, forcing the queens off the board, and what I'm banking on is that one of these two pawns will get to the end, and I will win the game. So, knight takes e4 is played by my opponent. I trade the queens on f8, and now I go knight to e7, trying to win this pawn on d5 or the knight on e4. Here, my opponent plays knight takes f2. Now, I felt that in this position, if black were to play knight f6, it's just winning, because here I can play a move like knight to c6, and if black goes to e4 here, now you can't push the d pawn. Very important here, because the d pawn is the only pawn that you can push straight down, but if you go e4 here after a5, there's no pawn push in the center of the board, and now I go a6, a7, a8, I push the p, and I win the game. So Knight takes f2 is played. I go bishop takes d5, and now my opponent plays bishop takes bishop, after which there is no coming back. King to h7 was the last try, but after b5, takes, let's just say knight to e4, for example, I can go b6, b7, and probably I should be winning here. Additionally, there's maybe g4, which is a little tricky, but I still think after takes and king g1, black is going to struggle to stop the p on the queen side. So we get bishop takes d5 here, but now instead of taking the bishop, I go knight g6, checking the king and forking the king and the rook. King g8, I take, and after rook c5, now black has a bishop and a knight for the rook, but with the two connected pawns on the queen side, even though black has 4 pawns, he's essentially going to have 2 pawns instead of 3 because 2 of the pawns are stacked on top of each other. Here my opponent goes bishop e6, I play rook takes e5, he goes king e7, and after I play this move a5, Dai Changren resigns the game here because there's no way of stopping the a-pawn from getting to the end of the board. There are two ways black can try. One is knight d3, but I sack the rook with rook takes bishop, king takes rook, a6, and now there's no way to stop a7, a8. The pawn gets to the end of the board, becomes a queen, and I win. Additionally here, if black plays king d6, again I sack the rook, and after a6, the king is too slow getting back, and I make a queen, and I win the game. So after a5, Dai Changren resigns this game, and I move to 2 out of 2, a perfect score so far. Obviously, many more games to go, but so far I feel like I've played some pretty good chess in the first 2 rounds, and I am tied for the lead. Tomorrow I will probably play someone 2600 plus. Should be the first serious test to see if I'm on form or not. But at any rate, I'm off to a good start, unlike Magnus, who's on 1 out of 2, but we still have many more rounds to go. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 2 of the Qatar Masters being held in Doha. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I will be back tomorrow with a recap after the 3rd round here in Qatar. See you guys soon. Bye.